What if Meghan Markle's dazzling smile, her meteoric rise from a cable TV actress to a duchess, wasn't simply the product of ambition, luck, and love, but instead linked to some of the darkest networks in modern history? What if the name Meghan Markle had once been whispered not in Hollywood studios or Kensington Palace corridors, but in the secret guest lists of Jeffrey Epstein's yachts, with Ghislaine Maxwell playing the role of gatekeeper? And what if Prince Harry, who believed he'd rescued a woman from relentless tabloid cruelty, suddenly found himself blindsided by allegations that the very woman he defended was hiding the most explosive connections of all? That's the shocking possibility unraveling now, and it's why this story matters more than ever. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because the name Epstein alone still sends chills down spines. The crimes, the cover-ups, the names of the powerful who brushed elbows with him. It all reads like a nightmare you can't wake up from. Yet, Ghislaine Maxwell's new revelations seem to suggest we've only scratched the surface. The world has seen politicians, billionaires, academics, and even royals entangled in Epstein's sinister web. Prince Andrew's humiliation remains etched into public memory. But now, whispers that Meghan Markle herself, long before she became a duchess, may have crossed paths with Epstein's inner circle are shaking the very foundations of the monarchy. Picture Harry for a moment, the boy who lost his mother in one of the most controversial tragedies of the 20th century, the soldier who tried to carve out an identity beyond the palace gates, the man who believed he found salvation in Meghan, someone he described as the love that freed him from the gilded cage of the monarchy. And now imagine him staring at headlines tying his wife to Epstein's yacht days, with claims from Ghislaine Maxwell that Meghan may have even been his first client. Can you see the shock? Can you imagine the private arguments, the tears, the denial, the fear that history might repeat itself, but in a darker, more twisted way? This is where the story begins. It doesn't matter whether you're a royal watcher, a skeptic of monarchy, or simply someone who followed the Epstein scandal with horror. This story cuts across them all, because it forces us to ask, how much of what we see in public is real, and how much is carefully manufactured illusion? Meghan Markle has always sold the story of being an outsider who stormed the palace walls. She was the self-made actress, the humanitarian, the woman who married her prince. But what if those yacht days revealed a different origin story? A story that tied her not to fairy tale castles, but to the shadowy circles of billionaires, exploiters, and fixers? And think about timing. Why now? Why would Ghislaine Maxwell, sitting in prison, suddenly allow Meghan's name to surface? Was this about revenge? Was this leverage? Was it a carefully planted piece of information designed to trade favors with prosecutors, or to shake the monarchy once more? These are the questions the public is asking, and they're the same questions Harry must be asking himself behind closed doors. Let's pause here. Imagine Harry and Meghan's glossy California lifestyle. The mansion, the celebrity neighbors, the Netflix deals, the Spotify contracts, all built on the image of a couple who escaped a cruel system and forged their own destiny. And now layer on the suggestion that Meghan's climb began not in spite of the elite's dark secrets, but through them. Doesn't that change everything? Doesn't that recast their carefully curated narrative into something more sinister? And here's the thing about Meghan. She's always been polarizing. You either see her as a victim of ruthless press harassment, or as a calculating figure who used charm, ambition, and manipulation to rise higher than anyone thought possible. This revelation doesn't just deepen that debate, it detonates it. If Meghan was indeed tied to Epstein's circle, even briefly, the implications ripple everywhere. The monarchy's fragile reputation, Harry's credibility as a man who tells his truth, and Meghan's own brand as a voice for women and victims of exploitation. The irony would be almost unbearable. Ask yourself, if these yacht days really happened, who else knew? Did palace officials know before Harry proposed? Did Meghan's friends whisper in Hollywood? Did journalists have hints, but bury the story out of fear of lawsuits? The power of Epstein's circle was always about silence. About the people who saw but never spoke, who knew but never acted. And now, years later, the silence cracks. And it's Meghan's name, not Andrew's, that's sliding into the headlines. Let's not pretend for a second that this doesn't terrify the monarchy. One Epstein scandal was nearly catastrophic. Andrew's disgrace remains a black mark on the crown. But Meghan? Meghan is different. She's global. She's American. She's biracial. She's already one of the most controversial figures ever to marry into the Windsor dynasty. And if her name is tied to Epstein's empire, the blowback could make Andrew's shame look like a footnote. The palace knows this. Harry knows this. Meghan knows this. And Maxwell, perhaps more than anyone, knows the value of dropping such a bombshell. But how did we get here? How does Meghan's timeline intersect with Epstein's? Why is Harry reportedly so shaken by the whispers? And why is Maxwell, of all people, the one pointing the finger now? These questions lead us into the first real chapter of this story, the yacht scene itself. Because long before tiaras, royal weddings, and Oprah interviews, Meghan Markle's story may have begun on the deck of a billionaire's boat, under the shadow of men who would later be exposed as predators. And what happened on that yacht would set into motion a chain of whispers, cover-ups, and denials that stretch all the way from Hollywood to Buckingham Palace. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if I told you that Meghan Markle's fairy tale journey from Hollywood actress to Duchess of Sussex may have started not with a prince, not with a breakthrough acting role, but with a yacht? Picture this: champagne flowing, music thumping, billionaires lounging on sunbeds, models and aspiring actresses mingling in designer swimsuits, all under the Mediterranean sun. On the surface, it was just another glamorous party. But underneath, a dark undercurrent. A system where young women were carefully selected, groomed, and introduced to men with unimaginable power. A system where the line between opportunity and exploitation blurred into nothing. Now, imagine Meghan, still a struggling actress, still years away from the palace, stepping onto that deck. Was it ambition that led her there? Curiosity? Or something else entirely? Here's the truth. Yacht parties weren't just parties. They were recruitment grounds. They were Epstein's playgrounds, Maxwell's stage. Models, actresses, and influencers were the bait. Billionaires, politicians, and royals were the catch. For some women, it was a stepping stone. For others, a trap. And for Meghan? Well, that's the question shaking headlines today. Think about it. In Meghan's Hollywood days, she was hustling. Bit roles, commercials, a briefcase girl on Deal or No Deal. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't secure. She was looking for a breakthrough, any way to stand out in a brutal industry. And what was one of the fastest ways aspiring actresses found themselves in the company of the rich and powerful? Exclusive yacht parties. These gatherings were whispered about in LA circles. They were half myth, half promise. If you got the invite, it meant you'd arrived. But arriving came with a price. Let's pause here and ask, how many of you believe Meghan could have resisted that kind of opportunity? How many of you believe that when you're young, ambitious, and desperate for your big break, you say no to billionaires offering connections? And this is where the story begins to twist. Because on one of those yachts, according to whispers tied to Ghislaine Maxwell, Meghan wasn't just another face in the crowd. She stood out. She was noticed. And who else was there? The one man whose name still makes the world shudder, Jeffrey Epstein. Think about the optics. Epstein's yachts weren't just floating parties. They were floating dossiers. Every woman who boarded, every man who attended, became part of a network he controlled. Photographs, guest lists, rumors, all tucked away in his files. And now, years later, Maxwell is letting slip that Meghan wasn't just a guest. She may have been categorized as Epstein's first client. The idea alone is explosive, because if true, it changes everything we think we know about Meghan's path. Was her early exposure to elite circles accidental, or was it engineered? Did she stumble into Epstein's world, or was she pulled into it, just like so many others? But let's go deeper. Yacht parties weren't random. They were orchestrated. Epstein and Maxwell didn't just throw open the doors and hope for the best. No, they curated. Ghislaine was known as the socialite recruiter. She had an eye for spotting women who could play roles in Epstein's network. Meghan, biracial, articulate, pretty, educated, would have been the perfect candidate. She wasn't just another pretty face. She was marketable. She could blend into both Hollywood and high society. So here's the hook. Was Meghan's first step toward global fame not the set of Suits, not meeting Prince Harry, but climbing onto a yacht deck curated by Epstein and Maxwell? Now, imagine the scene. Meghan smiling, chatting, networking. Maybe she saw it as harmless. Maybe she thought it was just a glamorous party with important people. But what if, in that moment, she was being sized up, categorized, and filed away? What if the yacht was less about fun and more about testing grounds, finding out who could be molded, who could be used, who could be offered as clients? It's chilling, isn't it? And here's where the story gets even darker. Meghan has always told the world she was self-made, that she clawed her way up without shortcuts. But if Maxwell's revelations are true, then the yacht days were the shortcut, an initiation into a world that could open doors, but at a cost. Was Meghan just another player in Epstein's empire, or was she something more? This is where Harry enters the picture. Because for him, learning about Meghan's alleged yacht days wouldn't just be shocking, it would be devastating. He thought he'd found someone untouched by the corrupt royal system, someone different. But imagine discovering that Meghan's past wasn't free from scandal at all, that instead, it was tied to Epstein, the very name that already destroyed his Uncle Andrew's reputation. And this is why the yacht scene matters. It's not just about Meghan's past. It's about what it symbolizes, the beginning of a narrative that collides with the monarchy's darkest fears. So let me ask you, what would you have done in Meghan's shoes? Would you have stepped onto that yacht, chasing opportunity? Or would you have walked away, not knowing what doors it might close forever? Because the truth is, what Meghan did, or didn't do, on that yacht has now become one of the most whispered about mysteries in royal history. And the whispers are only getting louder. But here's the twist. The yacht scene was just the beginning. Because standing in the shadows of those decks was a woman who would change everything. Ghislaine Maxwell. She wasn't just another guest. She wasn't just mingling. She was watching, orchestrating, deciding who would be chosen. And Meghan, whether she knew it or not, had caught her attention. And what happened next would not only change Meghan's life forever, it would ignite a scandal that could rock the royal family to its core. What if the most important figure in Meghan Markle's alleged yacht days wasn't Jeffrey Epstein himself, but the woman standing silently at his side, scanning every face, every smile, every whispered exchange? That woman was Ghislaine Maxwell. And if Epstein was the architect of the empire, Ghislaine was the gatekeeper. She controlled access. She opened the doors, selected the women, and created the illusion of glamour that made his parties irresistible. And it's here, in the shadows of the yacht, that Meghan's story collides with one of the most infamous women of our time. Ghislaine Maxwell has always been a figure of contradictions. To some, she was a charming socialite, moving effortlessly among billionaires, politicians, and royalty. To others, she was a predator, a recruiter, the spider at the center of the web. What's undeniable is this. Maxwell had the power to shape destinies. With a single introduction, she could turn an unknown model into a jet-set darling. With one whispered recommendation, she could place a young actress into the orbit of men who could make, or break, her career. And Meghan? She was ambitious, hungry, ready for her big break. She had the looks, the education, the confidence. She was exactly the type Maxwell sought out. Women who could charm, entertain, and be paraded in front of Epstein's powerful friends. Women who were more than pretty faces, they were assets. And in Maxwell's twisted world, assets could be turned into currency. Now, imagine Ghislaine observing Meghan at one of those yacht gatherings. Meghan laughing, networking, doing what every ambitious young woman does, trying to make an impression. But unlike the other guests, Meghan had an aura. She wasn't just playing at being sophisticated, she was convincing. She could slip into conversations, charm wealthy men, and leave an impression. To Ghislaine, that made her valuable. Not disposable, like so many of the others, but potentially useful. Here's the chilling part. Maxwell wasn't just scouting women for Epstein. She was building a system. A system where women could be elevated, rewarded, if they played along. Where yacht parties weren't merely decadent escapes, but auditions. And Meghan, whether knowingly or not, may have passed that audition. But why Meghan? Why single her out? Because Meghan represented something rare. She wasn't just a model. She wasn't just a desperate actress. She had a narrative. She had a story of being biracial, educated, politically aware. She could appeal to elite men who wanted to appear progressive while indulging in darker appetites. She was the perfect mask, sophisticated on the surface, exploitable underneath. And Ghislaine knew how to weaponize that duality. Ask yourself, Doesn't that sound eerily similar to how Meghan later navigated the royal family? To how she balanced being modern and traditional, an outsider and an insider, vulnerable yet powerful? It's as if the skill set she honed on those yachts, blending in, standing out, adapting to every room, became the very tools she used to conquer Hollywood, then the monarchy. But let's return to Ghislaine. She wasn't just Epstein's partner, she was his enabler. Survivors described her as the one who made everything seem normal. She was the one who reassured, who smiled, who told girls it was safe. She was the one who could turn exploitation into an opportunity. And if Meghan encountered Ghislaine during those days, what did she hear? What was she promised? Was it connections? Roles? Invitations? Or was it something more sinister? And here's the contradiction that makes the story so explosive. Meghan has built her entire brand around women's empowerment, around being a voice for victims. She speaks about breaking barriers, about lifting others up. But if she once stood at the edge of Ghislaine Maxwell's world, even briefly, doesn't that flip her narrative upside down? Doesn't it force us to question whether Meghan was a victim, a participant, or something in between? Now, let's step into Prince Harry's shoes. Imagine learning that your wife may have been scouted by the same woman who recruited girls for Epstein. That Ghislaine Maxwell. The same figure tied to your disgraced Uncle Andrew once had her eyes on Meghan. Can you imagine the horror? The betrayal? For Harry, who spent years defending Meghan against tabloids, this revelation wouldn't just sting, it would shatter his trust. But here's where the tension rises even higher. Maxwell, from her prison cell, has little left to lose. Her reputation is destroyed. Her future is sealed. But her knowledge? That's her only currency. Every name she drops, every hint she gives, keeps her relevant. And Meghan Markle's name? That's dynamite. It doesn't just implicate an actress or a socialite. It implicates a duchess. It drags the royal family, once again, into Epstein's shadow. Why would Ghislaine do this? Revenge? Bargaining power? Or perhaps because Meghan symbolizes everything Maxwell now despises. Women who escaped the system and built power for themselves. By tying Meghan back to the yachts, Maxwell reclaims a piece of that narrative. She reminds the world. Don't forget, I was the one who opened those doors. And this is where the cliffhanger sharpens. Because while Meghan may have believed her yacht days were just fleeting memories, Ghislaine Maxwell never forgets. She remembers the faces. She remembers the names. And according to whispers, she remembers Meghan. The question now isn't whether Meghan ever crossed paths with Maxwell. The question is, how much did Meghan know, and how far did she go? Because the deeper we dig, the more one chilling truth emerges. The yacht wasn't the destination. It was just the beginning. And waiting beyond those waves was a circle of power players whose names would later haunt the world. And among them, men who would ensure Meghan's story was never as innocent as she wanted the world to believe. But what came next would explode even bigger, because the next chapter reveals who else was on those yachts. And their names weren't just powerful, they were untouchable. Until now. What if I told you that Meghan Markle's alleged yacht days were not about cocktails, laughter, and sunshine, but about power? About proximity to names that shaped the world in shadows? Because those yachts weren't just floating palaces, they were stages. And the guest list? That was the script. To step onto Epstein's yacht meant stepping into a network so influential, so untouchable, that even presidents, princes, and billionaires could be seen there without fear of exposure. Until now. Imagine the scene. A Mediterranean coastline. Expensive perfume mixed with sea air. Billionaires reclining in linen shirts. Politicians whispering over champagne. Celebrities pretending it was all harmless fun. And then the women, models, actresses, hopefuls, brought in to brighten the atmosphere. But it wasn't random. Every single face was chosen. Every single woman was cataloged. And this is where Meghan's story collides with Epstein's inner circle. Epstein's guest lists read like a nightmare of the elite. Former presidents, tech moguls, Hollywood producers, royalty, men who shaped global policy by day and indulged in hedonistic games by night. And standing quietly beside him, Ghislaine Maxwell, the curator, the recruiter, the woman who could make or break an invite. Now, think about this. If Meghan's name is tied to those gatherings, even at the edges, then she wasn't just networking at a party. She was being observed, assessed, positioned in a world that operated by rules the rest of us couldn't imagine. Here's a chilling question. How many of those men later recognized Meghan when she became a duchess? How many of them whispered to each other, "We remember her from TH." Take a moment and think about the implications. Prince Andrew's name already sits in infamy because of Epstein. Bill Clinton's reputation was scorched by repeated mentions. Even Donald Trump was forced to distance himself. These weren't obscure figures. They were presidents, princes, and moguls. And Meghan, if the whispers are true, was moving in those same circles. Ask yourself this. Does that sound like coincidence? And let's not forget, the royals knew Epstein. Andrew wasn't the only one. Epstein was photographed near the Windsors, seen at parties where aristocrats mingled with the elite. The monarchy may have wanted to bury that connection, but it existed. So when Harry married Meghan, thinking she was a fresh start, an outsider untainted by royal scandal, can you imagine his shock at realizing she might not have been an outsider at all, but already connected to Epstein's world years before? This is where irony cuts like a knife. Meghan built her image as the modern, innocent alternative to palace corruption. Yet now, the whispers suggest she may have been closer to that corruption than anyone knew. Let's dig deeper into Epstein's circle. These weren't just powerful men. They were predators cloaked in respectability. They knew that the presence of actresses and models gave them cover. It made the yachts look like fun, harmless indulgence. It let them pretend they weren't recruiting, exploiting, or trading favors. Meghan, as a young actress, would have fit perfectly into that illusion. Not just eye candy, but someone who could hold a conversation, charm influential men, make them feel enlightened for being around a biracial, educated woman. Doesn't that align disturbingly well with the role she later played on the world stage? Now imagine Meghan at one of those gatherings. Who was sitting across from her at dinner? A Hollywood producer promising opportunities? A politician whispering connections? Or a royal, already entangled in Epstein's circle? These aren't wild fantasies, they're logical questions, given who Epstein invited. And let's remember, Epstein's strategy wasn't chaos. It was control. He documented everything. Guest logs, photographs, surveillance. If Meghan's name appears in Maxwell's files, as some claim, then somewhere in that mountain of evidence is proof. Proof that the Duchess of Sussex once shared space with men whose names now define scandal. But here's where the suspense spikes. Why hasn't this come out sooner? Why now, with Maxwell behind bars, is Meghan's name starting to surface? Was it suppressed? Protected? Or was it simply waiting? Waiting for the right moment to detonate? This is where Ghislaine's role becomes even more sinister. She knows the names. She knows the context. And she knows the value of those names. Dropping Meghan's into the mix isn't just about truth, it's about leverage. Because Meghan's connection doesn't just incriminate her. It splashes back onto Harry, onto the monarchy, onto a family still desperate to recover from Andrew's disgrace. Think of the domino effect. If Meghan's ties to Epstein's world were confirmed, how fast would the public turn? How fast would the monarchy distance itself from Harry and Meghan? And how quickly would Meghan's carefully built brand of empowerment collapse under the weight of irony? And yet, here's the contradiction. If Meghan really was present, was she a victim or a participant? That's the question Maxwell dangles. That's the curiosity that keeps the public hooked. And it's the same question Harry must be asking himself in private, as he replays every moment of their relationship, every story Meghan told about her past. Because Epstein's yachts weren't just boats. They were traps. And Meghan's alleged presence there links her to a circle of names so toxic, so radioactive, that even the faintest connection is enough to cause panic in palaces and penthouses alike. But this is just the surface. Because the story isn't just about who Meghan met on those yachts. It's about what those men wanted, what they promised, and how those encounters shaped the path she took next. And one detail, buried in Maxwell's hints, makes it clear Meghan wasn't just another guest. She may have been singled out. She may have been categorized. She may have been, in Epstein's chilling words, a first client. And that phrase, that claim, it changes everything. Because if Meghan was Epstein's first client, then the yacht wasn't just a party. It was an initiation. And the next chapter reveals how Meghan's Hollywood struggles and ambitions made her the perfect target for Epstein and Maxwell's empire. And what came next would blur the line between opportunity and exploitation in ways no one saw coming. What if Meghan Markle's biggest temptation didn't come from Hollywood casting directors or royal courtiers, but from the seductive promises whispered in the shadows of Epstein's world? To understand why the yacht days matter, we have to rewind. We have to step back into Meghan's Hollywood years, those struggling days when the line between desperation and opportunity blurred into something dangerous. Because this is where the trap was set. Imagine Meghan in her 20s, an actress hustling in Los Angeles. No guaranteed paycheck, no leading roles. Just endless auditions, rejection, and the brutal reminder that in Hollywood, talent alone rarely opens doors. Meghan herself admitted she took small jobs to pay the bills. Commercials, a few lines on a TV show, a briefcase girl on Deal or No Deal. Nothing screamed stardom. Nothing screamed Duchess. She was ambitious, yes, but ambition without opportunity can be suffocating. Now imagine someone telling her there was a shortcut. Not the traditional grind. Not waiting years for a breakthrough. A shortcut through private dinners, exclusive yacht trips, and introductions to men who could write checks, greenlight roles, or pull strings. Do you think she would have said no? This is where the irony cuts deep. Meghan has often described herself as a fighter, someone who earned everything without compromise. But behind the scenes, she was navigating the same temptations every struggling actress faces. The casting couch wasn't just a cliché, it was a system. And Epstein's network? It was like the casting couch, amplified 100 times over. With Ghislaine Maxwell whispering reassurances and Epstein dangling promises. How could anyone desperate for success resist? Let's pause for a moment. Picture Meghan at yet another failed audition. She leaves the studio lot, rejected again. Bills piling up, dreams slipping, and then the phone rings, an invitation. A yacht party, connections, people who can help your career. That's the hook. That's the bait. And this is the contradiction. Was Meghan a victim of circumstance, or was she a willing participant in a system that rewarded compromise? Because in those days, Meghan wasn't just ambitious. She was strategic. Friends described her as always looking for the next step up, always networking, always thinking 2 moves ahead. That mindset is how she maneuvered into the British aristocracy later. But it may have begun in Hollywood, with those temptations. Here's where it gets chilling. Survivors of Epstein's circle describe how women were told they were special. They were promised connections, modeling jobs, acting opportunities. And often, those promises came true, at least on the surface. That's why Epstein's network thrived. It gave just enough reward to disguise the exploitation underneath. So imagine Meghan suddenly finding doors opening. Was it luck? Or was it the system quietly pulling her forward? And think of the timing. Meghan landed her role in Suits in 2011. But before that, there were years of obscurity. Years when she was hustling, waiting for her moment. Those are the years the yacht whispers place her near Epstein's orbit. Doesn't that make you wonder? Ask yourself, if Meghan was indeed Epstein's first client, as Maxwell hinted, what did that mean? Did it mean Meghan was one of the first women Epstein tested in his transactional system? Did it mean she was used as an example for others? Or did it mean she was the first to benefit in ways that went beyond parties and cocktails? Because here's the devastating irony. Meghan built her brand later on as a feminist voice. She spoke about being objectified as a briefcase girl, about refusing to be silenced as a woman of color in Hollywood. Yet, if she navigated Epstein's temptations, then her entire narrative becomes a contradiction. The woman who says she rejected objectification may have built her path by walking straight into its darkest form. Now, let's shift to Harry. Imagine him, years later, listening to whispers about Meghan's past. He defended her against accusations of being calculating, against claims she climbed her way into his world. But this revelation, this idea that Meghan may have once accepted opportunities from Epstein's circle, wouldn't just be gossip to him. It would be betrayal. It would be proof that the woman he believed was pure and self-made may have compromised in ways he never imagined. And here's the palace's nightmare. Meghan's temptations weren't unique. They mirrored the very scandal that brought down Andrew. If Epstein's circle touched Meghan too, then the monarchy's curse deepened. It wasn't just one prince entangled in Epstein's world. It was 2 generations of Windsors, by blood and by marriage. Do you see the pattern? The same names, the same networks, The same temptations. This is why Maxwell's revelations sting so sharply. Meghan wasn't just any actress. She became a duchess. She became a global figure. She became, in many ways, untouchable. But Epstein's circle thrives on the untouchable. It thrives on the people we least expect to be compromised. And so, the question hangs heavy. Was Meghan's Hollywood struggle a tragedy or a test? Did she resist temptation, or did she surrender to it, only to later rewrite the story in her favor? Because what came next wasn't just about temptations. It was about categorization, about being labeled, about being placed into Epstein's system not as a guest, but as a first client. And that phrase, that haunting label, would become the darkest thread tying Meghan Markle's Hollywood past to the royal family's most dangerous scandal. But what came next would push this story into an even darker corner, because the files, the documents, and the testimonies began to surface. And buried in them were clues that Meghan's yacht days were far more than whispers. What if the most devastating phrase to ever hang over Meghan Markle's name wasn't diva, manipulative, or even opportunist, but instead two words whispered by Ghislaine Maxwell herself: first client? Think about that. Out of all the young women who crossed Epstein's path, out of all the countless yacht girls, models, and starlets, Maxwell allegedly singled out Meghan with this chilling label. Not guest, not associate, not companion, client. That changes everything. Because a client suggests an arrangement, a transaction, something more deliberate, more documented, more damning. If Meghan truly was Epstein's first client, then her past isn't just shadowed by rumor. It's shackled to the most toxic scandal of the century. Let's step back. Epstein's system wasn't chaos. It was calculated. He didn't just surround himself with random women. He recruited, he cataloged, he managed. His empire was built on transactions disguised as glamour. And in that system, a first client would have been symbolic. The pioneer, the template, the woman who proved the system worked. So ask yourself, why would Maxwell choose those words? Why would she, with everything to lose, risk dropping Meghan's name in this way? Was she telling the truth, or was she twisting it for her own survival? Maxwell has always been manipulative. Even from prison, she knows the value of a well-placed revelation. But there's a reason Meghan's name resonates. Her timeline fits. Her ambition fits. Her presence at yacht parties fits. And so does her meteoric rise after years of struggle. Doesn't it sound disturbingly like the profile of someone who may have benefited from Epstein's transactional world? And here's where irony sharpens into tragedy. Meghan has built her image on authenticity, on being real. She tells the story of being a struggling actress, hustling for every opportunity. She tells us she made it through grit and determination. But if the first client claim is true, then her rise wasn't just about grit. It was about compromise. It was about deals struck in shadows. Think about the contradiction. Meghan speaks of empowerment, yet the phrase first client reduces her not to a woman of power, but to a commodity. The very thing she rails against in public speeches may have been the foundation of her private ascent. Now, let's consider the implications for Harry. Imagine the man who stood on global stages defending Meghan against accusations of opportunism. Imagine the husband who cut ties with his family to protect her. And then imagine him hearing whispers that Meghan's entire past could be summarized in two devastating words tied to Epstein. Wouldn't that shake him to the core? Wouldn't that make him question every detail she told him about her early career? And the palace? Oh, the palace would panic. Andrew's disgrace nearly broke them. Another Epstein scandal, this time tied to Harry's wife? It would be catastrophic. Meghan wasn't just a royal by blood. She was the face of a modern monarchy. If she truly carried the label of first client, the monarchy's credibility would collapse. But here's the question that keeps the public hooked. Is it true? Or is it a trap? Let's look at the possibilities. If it's true, then Meghan's entire life story unravels. Her Hollywood struggles were never innocent. They were strategic steps facilitated by the darkest network imaginable. Her role on Suits, her rising star, her eventual leap into royal circles. All of it takes on a sinister context. If it's a trap, then Maxwell is weaponizing Meghan's name to destabilize the monarchy and maintain her own relevance. By dropping Meghan's name, Maxwell doesn't just cause scandal. She ensures her legacy of control continues even from behind bars. After all, who benefits from destroying Meghan? Maxwell, who gains attention. The press, who gains headlines. And perhaps even enemies of the monarchy, who gain leverage. But here's the thing. Even if it's a trap, the damage is done. Because once the words Meghan Markle and first client appear together, they can't be separated. The curiosity, the suspicion, the whispers, they'll never vanish. And let's not forget the evidence. Epstein documented everything. Guest lists, photos, transactions. If Maxwell's claim has even a grain of truth, then somewhere in those files lies proof. And the world knows it's only a matter of time before more documents emerge. Can you imagine the panic in Montecito every time another Epstein file surfaces? Can you picture Harry and Meghan scanning headlines, praying her name isn't there? Now, consider the irony again. Meghan, who has accused the monarchy of silencing and controlling her, may have been controlled long before she ever wore a tiara. Not by courtiers, not by the press, but by Epstein and Maxwell, through a system she thought she escaped. And this is where the cliffhanger deepens. Because whether truth or trap, the phrase first client ties Meghan forever to Epstein's empire. It forces us to question everything about her story, her marriage, and her role in the monarchy. But here's the twist: the files, the documents, the transcripts. Because what comes next isn't just whispers, it's evidence. And buried in those sealed records may lie the answer to whether Meghan's name was simply gossip or proof of something much darker. And when those files begin to surface, the world won't just be asking about Meghan's past. They'll be asking about the monarchy's future. But what came next would drag us into those very files, exposing the secrets that Maxwell tried to bury, secrets that no royal PR team could ever erase. What if the most dangerous weapon Ghislaine Maxwell still holds isn't her memory, isn't her ability to charm reporters from a prison cell, but the files, the documents, the court transcripts, the sealed evidence that investigators have barely scratched? Because here's the reality. Epstein didn't operate like an ordinary predator. He operated like a banker. Every guest, every encounter, every transaction was cataloged, filed, and stored. His empire wasn't built on secrecy, it was built on documentation. And if Meghan Markle's name appears anywhere in those files, even on the fringes, then her world, and Harry's, could come crashing down. Let's step into the chilling archive. Epstein's black books, the flight logs, the guest lists, the surveillance tapes. Survivors testified that Epstein kept everything. Photos, notes, contacts. Why? Because evidence was leverage. And leverage meant control. With one dossier, Epstein could destroy reputations or secure favors. It was his insurance policy. And Maxwell, his right hand, knew every detail. Now imagine the files. Imagine pages of names we recognize. Politicians, billionaires, actors, royals. And buried in those pages, a name that doesn't belong. Not yet anyway. Meghan Markle, a struggling actress, unknown to the world, but already cataloged in a predator's empire. Doesn't that image send a shiver down your spine? Here's the twist. These files exist. Portions have already been unsealed. Journalists pore over them. Survivors reference them. Courts battle over what can be made public. And with every unsealing, new names appear. Some shock us. Some confirm suspicions. And each time, the question grows louder. Will Meghan's name appear? Think of the tension in Montecito. Harry and Meghan scrolling through headlines, dreading the next unsealing. Every time Maxwell's deposition is referenced, every time the press hints at new revelations, the Sussexes must hold their breath. Because one mention, just one, would undo years of careful branding, PR, and victimhood narratives. And here's where the contradiction deepens. Meghan built her reputation as a woman who spoke truth to power. She criticized the monarchy for hiding secrets. She demanded transparency. Yet if she's in those files, then her own past is stained with the very secrecy she condemned. The hypocrisy would be devastating. But let's not forget the victims' testimonies. Over and over, women described how Maxwell recruited them under the guise of opportunities. Modeling jobs, acting gigs, introductions to powerful men. And then, exploitation. Many of these women say their names were recorded, their presence documented. Meghan, as an aspiring actress in those circles, fits the profile perfectly. Too perfectly. Now ask yourself, why hasn't her name surfaced publicly yet? Is it buried in sealed transcripts, protected by lawyers, shielded by settlements? Or has it been deliberately withheld, waiting for the right moment? Because Maxwell's strategy isn't truth, it's timing. She knows when to drop a bomb. And Meghan's name would be the ultimate bomb. And consider this. Prince Andrew's downfall began not with photos, not with a trial, but with documents, testimonies, depositions, court filings that turned whispers into facts. If that could destroy the Queen's son, what could similar documents do to Harry's wife? Now picture Harry, reading through news reports, watching as each new unsealing chips away at royal credibility. He already lived through Andrew's disgrace. He knows what evidence can do. And now, the possibility that his wife's past could be documented in those same files. How does a man survive that? How does a marriage survive that? But here's the cruel irony. Meghan herself knows the power of documents. She sued newspapers. She fought to control her narrative in legal filings. She knows how a single line in a deposition can reshape public opinion. And that's exactly why Maxwell's files terrify her. Because once it's in black and white, it's no longer rumor, it's history. And this is where the cliffhanger sharpens. Because whispers suggest that buried in Maxwell's depositions are references to Meghan, references that haven't yet been unsealed. If true, then the next round of document releases could be catastrophic. The world isn't just waiting for gossip anymore. It's waiting for proof. So here's the haunting question. What happens when those files finally speak? What happens if Meghan's name emerges alongside Epstein's other recruits? Does the world see her as a victim or as a willing player? Does Harry stand by her? Or does the monarchy finally sever ties for good? Because the documents don't lie. They don't spin. They don't charm. They record. And once they surface, the truth, whatever it is, will be undeniable. But what came next wasn't just about files locked in courtrooms. It was about the irony of fate itself. Because even as Meghan was climbing Hollywood's ladder, another twist of destiny was waiting. The moment she met Harry. And what Harry thought was love at first sight may have actually been the most dangerous blind spot of his life. What if the love story that captivated the world, the fairy tale romance of a prince and an actress, was built on the most dangerous blind spot in royal history? Because when Harry met Meghan, he thought he was rescuing her. He thought he was pulling her from the jaws of a ruthless press, a cold palace, a world of tradition that had devoured his mother. But what if, instead, he was stepping straight into the shadow of Meghan's past, a past that tied her not to innocence, but to the dark, transactional empire of Epstein and Maxwell? Picture Harry in those early days, a soldier back from Afghanistan, a man haunted by paparazzi flashes, by the loss of Diana, by years of being the spare. When he met Meghan, he saw light. He saw warmth. He saw someone who wasn't part of the palace machine. She was different. American. Independent. A woman who had carved out her own life. That was the story Meghan sold him. That was the story Harry bought. But here's the sting. What if that story wasn't the whole truth? What if the woman Harry thought was untouched by scandal had already danced at the edges of it? What if the woman he believed was a fresh start was actually carrying the most toxic baggage imaginable? That's what Maxwell's whispers suggest. And it's why this chapter is the most devastating of all. Harry has always been searching for salvation. He looked for it in the army, in charity work, in wild nights at clubs. And then he found Meghan. Or so he thought. She was glamorous enough to fit his world, yet ordinary enough to make him believe he'd found real love. She listened. She empathized. She told him she understood. And Harry, vulnerable, emotional, desperate for escape, fell hard. But imagine Harry years later, sitting in Montecito, hearing Maxwell's revelations. Imagine him replaying their first dates, their conversations, the stories Meghan told about her past. Imagine the pit in his stomach as he realizes there may have been entire chapters she never shared. How do you reconcile that? How do you forgive that? And here's the contradiction. Meghan's yacht days, if true, weren't just irrelevant flings or parties. They were potentially tied to Epstein's system. A system Harry already knew intimately, not through Meghan, but through Andrew. His own uncle was destroyed by Epstein's orbit. The family suffered humiliation. The monarchy was dragged into court cases and depositions. Harry saw the damage firsthand. He saw the shame etched on the Queen's face. And then, years later, to learn that his wife may have been in the same orbit? Can you imagine the devastation? The irony is almost unbearable. Harry believed he had found someone who shared his pain, someone who would help him escape the palace's ghosts. But instead, Meghan may have brought new ghosts to his doorstep, ones darker than anything he ever imagined. Let's pause here. Ask yourself, did Meghan ever tell Harry the full story? Did she confess the Yacht days? Did she explain the whispers? Or did she bury them, hoping the files would stay sealed, hoping Maxwell would stay silent? Because here's the reality. Love stories thrive on trust. And Harry trusted Meghan completely. He gave up his home, his family, his military titles, all for her. But what happens to that trust when you discover your wife may have been part of Epstein's network? That she may have been cataloged, labeled, even called a first client? And this is where the palace's fears collide with Harry's blind spot. The monarchy may have had its doubts about Meghan. They may have whispered about her ambition, her past relationships, her hunger for fame. But even the palace never imagined this. Epstein's shadow touching Meghan? That would explain the frosty reception, the private warnings, the quiet disapproval. Did they know more than Harry did? Did they try to warn him? Or were they just suspicious, sensing something they couldn't quite prove? Harry's blind spot wasn't just Meghan's charm. It was his own pain. He wanted so badly to escape the monarchy's cruelty that he ignored every red flag. He saw criticism of Meghan as racism, as jealousy, as history repeating itself. He refused to believe she could be anything other than his savior. And that blind devotion may now be his greatest mistake. Think of the conversations in Montecito. Harry asking questions, Meghan deflecting, Harry insisting on answers, Meghan accusing him of betrayal. The tension, the tears, the silence afterward. Can you picture it? Because when your marriage is built on the idea of absolute trust, a secret like this doesn't just cause a fight, it detonates everything. And here's the cliffhanger. Because while Harry may be struggling with whispers, the real storm is still to come. The files aren't done. The testimonies aren't done. And Maxwell? She isn't done. The woman who once chose Meghan may still hold the power to destroy her. And Harry knows that when those names surface, it won't just be Meghan on trial. It will be him, his marriage, and the future he sacrificed everything to build. But what came next would prove that Harry's blind spot wasn't just personal, it was political. Because while he clung to his love story, the royal family was bracing for déjà vu. And Meghan's yacht whispers weren't just her problem. They were about to become the monarchy's second Epstein scandal. What if the British monarchy's worst nightmare wasn't the press, wasn't public scrutiny, and wasn't even the painful legacy of Diana's death, but history repeating itself in the most grotesque way possible? Because the House of Windsor had already endured humiliation once with Prince Andrew. The Epstein scandal cracked the image of untouchable dignity. It dragged the Queen's own son into the mud. And just as the dust was settling, just as they thought no further damage could be done, whispers emerged that Meghan Markle, Harry's wife, the very woman the palace distrusted from the beginning, was connected to the same shadowy empire. Think about the scale of this crisis. Andrew's disgrace was bad enough. A prince accused of intimate ties to a convicted predator. Lawsuits, settlements, photos that could never be erased. The monarchy tried to bury it, to silence it, to distance itself. But Andrew's name became synonymous with shame. The Queen was forced to strip him of military titles. He vanished from public life. And still, the stain remained. Now imagine the palace learning that Meghan, already controversial, already divisive, was whispered about in the same breath as Epstein. Can you picture the panic? The whispered emergency meetings at Buckingham Palace? The advisors pacing the halls, asking, how many scandals can the monarchy survive? Because here's the truth. One Epstein scandal nearly broke them. A second? It would be catastrophic. The irony is brutal. Meghan was supposed to be the monarchy's fresh face, the modern duchess who brought diversity and relevance. She was supposed to symbolize progress. Instead, she may symbolize exposure of the monarchy's deepest vulnerabilities. A woman from outside their circle bringing in a scandal darker than any palace affair, darker even than Diana's tragic story. Let's ask the hard question. Did the royal family know? It wouldn't be the first time palace investigators dug into the past of a royal fiancé. Background checks are standard. They comb through relationships, finances, even friendships. If whispers about Meghan's yacht days reached the palace before the wedding, did they warn Harry? Did they urge caution? Or did Harry's stubbornness, his blind devotion, make him dismiss every red flag? And what about William? The brothers were already at odds. William was skeptical of Meghan from the start, warning Harry to take it slow. What if that skepticism wasn't just about her being an outsider, but about things William may have heard? Whispers he couldn't prove but dared not ignore. Imagine the tension if William suspected Meghan's past but couldn't convince Harry to see it. Imagine the fury now, as Maxwell's hints surface, confirming the very doubts William tried to raise. But let's not stop at palace whispers. Think about the monarchy's public image. The institution survives on perception, on the illusion of moral authority. The Queen once said the monarchy must be seen to be believed. What happens when what's seen isn't dignity, but scandal? When Meghan's name appears next to Epstein's, the monarchy, already battered by Andrew, would face a tidal wave of shame. Now think of Charles, a new king, fragile in his popularity, desperate to steady the crown. He tolerated Harry's rebellion, endured the Oprah interview, even accepted Harry's accusations in spare. But Epstein, Meghan, that's a different battlefield. That's not family drama. That's existential crisis. A monarchy tethered to predators cannot survive in the modern world. Charles knows this. He saw how Andrew's scandal almost toppled his mother's legacy, and the fear that Meghan's past might drag them there again would terrify him. This is why palace insiders would scramble. Damage control, silence, deflection, anything to distance the crown from Meghan. But how do you distance yourself when the scandal involves Harry's wife, the son Diana left behind, the prince who once was the monarchy's most beloved figure? Cutting him off would be political suicide. Keeping him close would be reputational suicide. Do you see the impossible dilemma? And then there's Harry himself. For the family, his blind devotion is the real danger. Andrew denied, deflected, and eventually disappeared. But Harry? Harry would defend Meghan to the bitter end. He'd lash out at the press, at the palace, at anyone who dared question her. His blind spot isn't just a personal weakness. It's a liability to the entire crown. Because if the files confirm anything, Harry won't be a bystander. He'll be the man defending the indefensible. This is why the palace fears history repeating. Not just the scandal itself, but the way it unfolds. The press will dig. Survivors will speak. Maxwell will drop names. And the monarchy will be dragged, kicking and screaming, back into Epstein's world. And this time, it won't be Andrew. It will be Harry, the son Diana adored, the boy the world once pitied, the prince who walked behind his mother's coffin. If he's caught in this, the monarchy's moral foundation crumbles. Ask yourself, how many scandals can one monarchy survive? Diana's death, Charles and Camilla, Andrew and Epstein, Harry and Meghan's rebellion. And now, potentially, Meghan's yacht days tied to Maxwell's files. Is it any wonder that palace aides whisper about survival, about whether the monarchy can even endure another decade? But here's the cruel twist. The palace may fear history repeating, but Meghan may see it as history rewritten. Where the monarchy sees disgrace, Meghan may see opportunity to paint herself once again as the victim, as the woman silenced, as the outsider hunted by elites. And Harry, lost in his blind devotion, may follow her script. But what comes next isn't about palace fears, it's about Maxwell's motives. Because the question that looms isn't just whether Meghan was tied to Epstein. It's why Maxwell, of all people, is the one exposing her. Revenge? Bargaining power? Or something far more sinister? And what came next would prove that Meghan's fate was no longer in her own hands. It was in Maxwell's, and Maxwell had nothing left to lose. What if Meghan Markle's most dangerous enemy isn't the British press, the palace courtiers, or even her own fractured family, but Ghislaine Maxwell herself? A woman with nothing left to lose, sitting in a prison cell, knowing her only remaining power is her ability to ruin others. Because when Maxwell let Meghan's name slip into the Epstein conversation, it wasn't random. It wasn't an accident. It was a calculated move. And the motive? Revenge. Think about it. Maxwell has been convicted, disgraced, locked away. Once she was the queen of elite circles, dining with presidents, dancing with billionaires, and whispering into the ears of royals. Now she's a prisoner, stripped of her power, her status, her freedom. But what hasn't been stripped away? Her knowledge, the names, the secrets, the files locked inside her memory. That's her currency. That's her weapon. And Meghan Markle's name? That's dynamite. Let's dig into the psychology. Maxwell has always been described as manipulative, calculating, vindictive. Even her former friends say she had a cruel streak, a taste for control. She wasn't just Epstein's partner. She thrived on the power his empire gave her. To recruit, to command, to decide who was chosen. And now, in her downfall, she sees others climbing. Women who escaped, women who thrived, women who lived the lives she lost. Meghan Markle fits that mold perfectly. Imagine Maxwell watching from her cell as Meghan and Harry sit in their Montecito mansion, signing multi-million-dollar deals, speaking about empowerment, condemning exploitation. To Maxwell, it must feel like salt in an open wound. Because if the whispers are true, Meghan was once part of her world. And now she's rewriting the story, pretending she was never touched by it. Doesn't that sound like the kind of hypocrisy Maxwell would relish exposing? But revenge isn't the only motive. There's leverage. Maxwell knows every name she drops sends shockwaves. She knows prosecutors, journalists, and power brokers lean in whenever she hints at a revelation. By naming Meghan, Maxwell does more than stir gossip. She reinserts herself into relevance. She reminds the world, I may be in prison, but I can still bring down the powerful. And the monarchy? Meghan's name isn't just scandalous, it's catastrophic. By tying Meghan to Epstein, Maxwell drags the royal family back into the mud. She forces them to confront the very scandal they're desperate to bury. She reminds them that Andrew wasn't an isolated disgrace. She widens the stain. And for someone like Maxwell, that's the sweetest revenge of all, humiliating an institution that once welcomed her at its parties and banquets. Now, let's ask the hardest question. Why Meghan? Out of all the names Maxwell could have dangled, why her? The answer may lie in Meghan's contradictions. Meghan has made herself untouchable in a way most others haven't. She wrapped herself in the cloak of victimhood, of empowerment, of feminism. She became a global symbol of resilience. That makes her the perfect target. Because to expose Meghan isn't just to reveal a name, it's to shatter an entire narrative. Think of the headlines. Meghan Markle tied to Epstein's circle. For Maxwell, that's more than gossip. That's nuclear. And here's where the personal angle deepens. Maxwell has always been obsessed with women who seemed to win in elite circles. She saw them as rivals, as competitors. Meghan, biracial, ambitious, married to a prince, represents everything Maxwell once craved. Prestige, power, influence. For Maxwell to name her, even in whispers, is a way of reclaiming dominance. A way of saying, you think she's clean? You think she's pure? I know the truth. But let's not ignore the most chilling possibility. What if Meghan's name wasn't dropped out of spite, but as part of a bargaining chip? Maxwell still faces legal pressure. Her sentence may be fixed, but her conditions, her appeals, her future could all hinge on her cooperation. By offering names, especially explosive ones like Meghan, she buys attention. She buys negotiation. She buys time. And Meghan's name, tied to royalty, tied to Hollywood, tied to the American dream, is the ultimate bargaining tool. Now imagine the ripple effect. Harry, blindsided. The monarchy, panicked. Meghan, furious. And Maxwell, sitting back, watching the chaos unfold, savoring every headline. Because even behind bars, she's controlling the narrative. Even in disgrace, she's pulling strings. But here's the cruel twist. Whether Maxwell is telling the truth or not almost doesn't matter. Because once Meghan's name is tied to Epstein in public discourse, the damage is done. Reputation doesn't survive whispers like these. Doubt alone can destroy. Maxwell knows that. And that's why Meghan is the perfect target. Because the scandal doesn't need proof. It only needs suggestion. And that suggestion leaves Harry in the most impossible position. Defend Meghan, and he looks blind. Stay silent, and he looks complicit. Distance himself, and he looks broken. Every option is a trap. And who set that trap? Ghislaine Maxwell. But the story doesn't end there. Because revenge from a prison cell isn't just about names, it's about consequences. And as Maxwell stirs the pot, the media frenzy begins. The palace stays silent. And the whispers grow. The more Meghan tries to silence them, the louder they become. And what comes next isn't just Maxwell's revenge. It's the world's reaction. Because when the media smells blood, when journalists dig into yacht lists, photos, and court transcripts, the whispers become headlines. And the palace, no matter how much it tries, cannot contain the fire. But what came next would show that the real battle wasn't between Meghan and Maxwell. It was between Meghan and the press. And the palace's silence, instead of protection, would only make the whispers louder. What if the deadliest weapon against Meghan Markle wasn't Maxwell's memory, wasn't Epstein's files, but the relentless machinery of the media? Because once Meghan's name slipped into the whispers surrounding Epstein, it was like blood in the water. Journalists, tabloids, bloggers, everyone wanted a piece. And in a world where perception is often more powerful than truth, the headlines themselves could destroy her, even without proof. Picture the scene. It starts small, an obscure column, a late-night podcast, a fringe reporter mentioning Meghan's name alongside Epstein's yachts. At first, it sounds like wild gossip, the kind of thing mainstream outlets ignore. But then the whispers grow louder.